Should I hit continue?
Yeah, I think you need to, yeah.
Okay. Yes, you do.
Yeah, it's asking you if you're okay with all this, with the recording stuff.
Got it.
And would you mind sharing your slides just to make sure that works, Dhanya?
Oh, of course, yeah. Let me
Great.
go. Do you see things change as I advance?
Yep.
This seems good. Good.
It looks
Great.
good.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, so let's get started. Why not? People can quote walk into the room a minute late if they'd like. So good morning, everybody. I hope you're all enjoying today's snow day of no snow yet. It's my pleasure to welcome Dhanya Sridhar today to visit us virtually here at Johns Hopkins. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the Data Science Institute of Columbia, where she works with David Bly. She is right now doing work on causal inference methods for text and social networks. I know that she's been doing work at the intersection of NLP and causal methods, which is a really exciting area that I think some of us are really interested in. She did her PhD, she graduated 2.5 years ago from University of California, Santa Cruz. She assures me though, that she is from the East Coast and used to this weather, where she worked with Lisa Guitor, who was on my thesis committee actually. So I've known her for some amount of time. I don't want to know how many years, but a while. And her thesis was on learning structured and causal probabilistic models for computational social science. So I'm really happy to welcome her here today, and let me turn it over to her.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here and taking time out of your snow day, especially to join this talk. And I'm so excited to be here. I'm really excited by Johns Hopkins, and I'm excited to share with you about some of my recent work on causal inference with text data. And so I want to set the stage for causal inference, why it is and why it matters. And I'll just sort of do that by motivating some long-standing questions and areas of research that people have looked at. So across computer science and the social sciences, of course, people have been interested in how language and communication affect how people respond to what they read and see and hear. And people have also been looking at how perceptions of other attributes of people, such as gender and so on, also affects the way that they respond to the text that they see. So what are some commonalities underpinning these research areas? Well, I'll hope to kind of build out and convince you in this talk that these are causal questions. So fundamentally, they're about understanding the factors that drive various phenomenon. They're about asking why and discovering these causal patterns. And moreover, these patterns of interest, these causal factors that contribute to various types of responses, these patterns are hidden in the data. They're hidden in text. And so this is a big opportunity in our modern era, actually, because our lives are really entangled with digital platforms. So we participate on social media sites and online forums. News sites are a big part of our presence on the internet. And these platforms present a fairly easy way to get large-scale data sets. And these data sets give us a lens into people's behavior, but in the form of text. And so this is the basis for this talk. And what I'm really going to look at is how we can use these large text data sets to answer the kinds of causal questions that I motivated. And so, we think large-scale text data sets and our sort of natural instinct is to appeal to NLP methods, and our modern natural language processing methods are really good at learning complicated patterns from text data sets. So here are words embedded in a 3D space. Words that are close together are sort of semantically related. And these patterns are uncovered just from a big text corpus. So without any supervision or guidance, these methods just recover these patterns. And so to refine this question, in this talk, I'm going to explore how can we harness NLP methods to do the causal inference using large-scale text data sets. And so first, I want to establish what causal inference is and how it's different than prediction, which is often what we do when we are faced with NLP tasks. And so to do that, I'm going to turn my attention to one of these big research questions. And the first thing that I'm going to do is take this question about perceptions of gender and formalize it as a causal effect. So just in plain English, we're gonna ask, what is the causal effect of perceived gender on a reader's response to a document that they read? Pardon? Okay. All right. I thought I heard a question, but I'll keep going.
Keep going. I think that was a weird Zoom thing.
Okay, sounds good. And so first, what is an effect? What has to hold in order for there to be a causal effect? Well, an effect means that so long as the gender was perceived differently for the same document with the same writing and so on, so long as the gender was perceived differently, the response would change. So that's what it means for there to be a causal effect. And so now I'm going to talk about a little bit why we can't pick this effect up just by doing prediction. So suppose, for the sake of argument, that being perceived as female on some online platform did have a large effect. And I had some data, and I trained a classifier to predict responses from text data and some variable that was capturing the perceived gender. And so I fit this classifier and I look at the words, the features that are the most predictive, and I might find that actually this variable that actually was a driving causal factor is not very predictive, and instead this phrase from the text that's actually very correlated with being perceived as female or not, that ends up being one of the most predictive attributes. Okay, so the conclusions that we get out of this predictor don't kind of meet our intuitions for the causal effect that we were after. So the takeaway is that bringing NLP to bear on causal inference is going to require more than just applying methods to do prediction. And so in this talk, I will present two approaches from my recent work that bring to bear NLP in service of causal inference using these large text data sets. And I want to kind of set the stage for this type of work. There's a broader context around computational methods that aim to go beyond the standard settings that we deal with in machine learning. These include methods that can reason about causal models and causal knowledge, models for complicated text data, as well as models of data that's structured fundamentally as networks or as graphs. And my work as a postdoc and as a PhD student has been at the intersection of these topics. I've worked on models of network structured data. I've worked on causal models and looking at causal effects in networks. But in today's talk, what I'm really going to focus on is this work on causal effects with text. And so before I really dive into this talk, I'm going to spend just a few minutes giving a bit of background. So I know there are a lot of experts in the audience for causal inference, so just bear with me. I want to sort of define some concepts more crisply. And to do this, I want to pivot away from text data and focus on a simpler setting that doesn't involve text. And by simpler, I just mean more standard, by the way. Okay, so we're going to look at what is the effect of taking a drug on disease progression. And so the drug is going to be a treatment of interest here, and the disease progression status is going to be an outcome. And to formalize causal effects, this is one way of doing it, we need to talk about intervention. Okay, so here, intervening is denoted with mathematically with this do operator. And what we're saying is that there's a world in which I intervene and give everybody the treatment, and there's a world in which I intervene and prevent everybody from taking the treatment. And one way to formalize an effect is as a change in the average outcome across these two interventional worlds. And the key is that in the settings that I consider today in today's talk, we don't have access to these intervention distributions. And instead, what we have is observational data. So what I have is a data set. I've really oversimplified here. In this data set, all I have are information on who took the treatment. I have information on the outcome, and I have some covariate. In this case, it's the age groups of my patients. And so this is the data that I have. And the key observation is that in observational data, I can't report the causal effect simply by looking at the change in outcome across my treated and untreated patients. So this kind of goes to that the old adage that correlation is not causation. And this is because this change in expected outcome is explained by other factors. And so one story is that people who are older are more likely to take the treatment, and they're also less likely to get better. And so these variables, like the age group, they are confounders. They are creating an alternative correlation between the treatment and outcome that's different than the causal effect. Okay, so this red arrow is the driving effect that we're interested in, but then there's this sort of alternative source of explanation that's driven by the confounder. And causal inference from observational data is about, translating that quantity that involved interventions into just a function of the data that we observe. And so this is a long-standing and really well-studied area of research. And there are many methods for doing causal inference with observational data. But one of the key assumptions that I want to highlight here is that these methods require that we observe all confounders. And so that's going to be our sort of underpinning. And so we have these techniques, right? And so the big question is, why can't we just apply them even with our text data? What really changes in the text setting that makes it hard to apply these causal inference techniques? So to establish this a little bit more clearly, I want to kind of describe some of the attributes of a lot of settings where we apply causal inference techniques. And so often we measure confounding variables, as we did with the age group. We record who took the treatment or received the treatment or not. And the scale of settings varies greatly, but we might see thousands of confounders or more, but text is a different story. So in the text setting, the data that we collect is just a jumble of words, right? It's just this big word soup. And so for one, we don't measure confounding information. So the text contains noisy evidence of the confounders. Often we don't even know who took or who received a treatment or not, because treatments are latent properties that are in the text data. And the scale here is, sometimes we're working with millions of words and documents. And so the setting is just quite different and requires us to think about a different set of challenges. And so that's what I'm going to discuss in this talk. And the two approaches that I'm going to talk about focus on these two roles that text plays. In one case, the text is going to bury important confounding information for us. And in another case, I'm going to look at how we can do causal inference when we're dealing with latent properties of text. Okay, so I'm going to dive into this first work on extracting confounding patterns from text. And to do this, I'm going to set up a simple motivating example with online forums, particularly reddit.com. And in some parts of this online forum, people can volunteer their gender information. So what I've highlighted here is the comment posters self-labeled gender. And we also look at the upvotes that each comment receives. And so this is, in some sense, a signal of the text's popularity. And we're going to ask ourselves, what is the effect of the perceived gender on a comment's popularity? So this is kind of going back to that research question that I motivated in the earlier part of the talk. So to explore this, first, let's kind of articulate our assumed causal model of the world. And here it is. So a reader comes along and they see the text and they see this gender label. So they perceive a gender, they perceive various properties of the text, and taken together, they decide how many upvotes they're going to give this comment. And so one thing to note here is that there are kind of properties of the text data. So its topic, its style, and the gender label might be correlated with these properties. So one example might be that users that are labeled as M write more often about certain topics. And moreover, the outcome could also be correlated with these properties. So some topics might just receive more upvotes by virtue of being more popular. And so here's our sort of model of the world. And the game of causal inference is defining our effect using the language of intervention. So just in plain English, this effect here is asking, what is the change in upvotes when we manipulate this gender label among comments that are already labeled as M? Okay, so this is slightly different than the effect that I showed earlier, but only because we're conditioning on a certain group of posts, but otherwise, a lot of the intuitions still hold. And as before, we don't have access to these intervention distributions. This is not the data that I have. And I have instead observational data. And so we need to kind of clarify and articulate our assumptions. So here, the assumption is that it is the properties of text that are confounders. So how does this relate to the techniques that I talked about for doing causal inference, which there, the key assumption is there's no unobserved confounders. And so to say it a little bit differently, here, we're saying that the text itself could serve as the confounder. And this is because, again, as I said, latent properties of the text are the confounders. And we could just push through by using the text data itself to try to rule out the confounding effects due to text. So we think, we sort of had this intuition that we can appeal to these long-standing causal adjustment techniques, except that we need to adapt for the dimensionality of the text here. So remember, we're in the setting where we have a very, very high dimensional piece of data, and this presents challenges for our usual techniques. And so the technical insights that really drive this work are first thinking about dimensionality reduction. So a lot of techniques in machine learning and NLP are all about representing high dimensional data, such as text, as a low dimensional vector that sort of captures the fundamental meanings of the text. And so this ranges from things like principal component analysis to topic models, all the way to more recent methods, such as word embedding methods that are driven by our sort of big language models. And so so this is one kind of way forward, except that there's this big problem. So how do we know that any off-the-shelf dimensionality reduction technique that I use is going to produce a numerical representation of text that actually does capture the confounding information? How can I guarantee this? And so to address this, we're going to turn back to our adjustment techniques. And in particular, I'm going to focus on backdoor adjustment. And we're going to just look at the technique, and it'll reveal to us the role that confounding information plays. So this is backdoor adjustment. It is a way to rewrite causal effects in terms of observational quantities. And the key insight here is to look at the ingredients in this formula. So we see that the two key ingredients are these expected outcomes given the treatment and the confounder. And the insight is that kind of fitting these expected outcomes given data, this is exactly what supervised machine learning methods are for. Okay, so these are methods that, given data, are trying to predict the average outcome. And so taken together, the insight is going to be to get embeddings that contain confounding information. We actually sort of have translated the problem to one of supervised dimensionality reduction. Okay, so we want low dimensional representations of the text, but we're going to use these embeddings to predict the expected outcomes that are the key ingredients to causal adjustment. We're going to do this all together. And this kind of idea fits in a larger body of work about causal adjustment with text, as well as with representation learning methods, such as word embedding. So this first area of work is targeted specifically for causal inference, but typically it requires strong modeling assumptions, such as imposing, certain parametric models. And this work on representation learning provides a way to construct flexible embeddings of text data, but these embeddings might not always capture the information that we need specifically when we're doing causal inference from text. And so the appeal of this method is we can use flexible dimensionality reduction tools while ensuring that they capture confounding information that will then yield valid causal inference downstream with text data. So here's the sketch of the approach. It's called causally sufficient text embeddings. It's going to take as input documents, text documents, treatment labels, and outcome labels. And for every input, it'll produce an embedding and some predictions, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But the high-level sketch of this method is it's going to take an existing method for constructing word embeddings, and it will modify the objective so that the outputted embeddings are going to be valid for causal adjustment. So that's sort of the sketch here. And so here's the method. We're going to take any existing text representation approach, and these approaches produce embeddings lambda that capture the meaning of the word or the meaning of the document rather. And we're going to augment to this method two prediction tasks. So the first prediction task is to predict the outcome while using these embeddings. Okay, so one of the jobs of the embeddings is to predict these expected outcomes, which, as we saw, are the key ingredients to causal inference. And then second, these embeddings are going to predict the probability of receiving treatment. So we didn't see this earlier, but this quantity also kind of plays a role in causal adjustment, some of our adjustment techniques. And so we're going to augment these two prediction tasks to dimensionality reduction techniques, and they'll produce embeddings and predictions, where the key idea is that the predictions are going to be used to estimate effects. So I'm going to show one concrete example of a representation learning method that we adapted to do causally sufficient text embeddings. And I'm going to look at the BERT model. So BERT is a neural network that has millions of parameters, and these parameters have been trained by looking at billions of words in the English language. And so these models have been trained already, and the typical pipeline is to tune the parameters of this model specifically for different prediction tasks. And so that's what we're going to appeal to here. So here is the causal BERT algorithm, which takes as input, as BERT does, a sequence of tokens. This is the representation, the input representation of the document. And for every document, it associates with it an embedding, which we'll call here lambda. And on top of all this, we're going to train a classifier to predict the outcomes, the expected outcomes for two groups of documents, the treated and untreated documents. And we can do this, for example, by if we have real valued outcomes, we can minimize squared error to the true outcome label. And jointly, we're going to train a classifier that use the embeddings to predict the treatment label as well. And again, we can do this by minimizing the cross entropy loss with the true treatment labels, which remember were one of the inputs to this approach. And jointly, we're going to combine this with the original loss for the language model that was capturing semantic meaning in the word embeddings. Okay, so this is the method, and taken together, we give it a corpus of text and treatment labels and outcome labels. The model gets fit, and then for every document, it's going to output an embedding and these three predictions. And I mean, here's one example of a way in which these predictions are used to estimate effects. For the effect that I was showing earlier, this is one estimator that takes in the predictions that this model makes and calculates the causal effect. And again, the key detail here is that the embeddings, the predictions made by the model are what effects require. And there's some nice properties to this approach. So we prove that this causal sufficient text embeddings algorithm will produce embeddings that contain the confounding information. Okay, so it's given the assumptions that I made earlier in my causal model, these embeddings are going to be valid for causal inference. And moreover, with some extra assumptions, we can consistently estimate effects. And so, you know, we have this result, but now we want to see how these methods bear out in practice. And, you know, this is sort of breaking our usual mold of how we do evaluation in machine learning. So there's no ground truth here. Okay, so I don't really have ground truth causal effects against which to see how well my methods can estimate effects. And so what we're going to do is use as much real data as possible. So we'll take a corpus of real text documents and treatment labels and only simulate outcomes. So the way to think about this is we're sort of simulating a human reader with a computer. Okay, and so we can plug in different models. And so let me give an example of this. So we took Reddit comments, those user-provided gender labels, and subreddit, which in this case is a property that can be associated with the text data. And so we're going to simulate upvotes as a function of the gender label and the subreddit, which is going to act as our confounder here. And so this is just a simple example of one way to simulate outcomes. There are many others, but the game that we can play is create increasingly more confounding. So we can have the upvotes rely increasingly on the confounder variable here. And as the situation gets more and more confounded, we can evaluate our method's ability to estimate causal effects. And again, remember here, we're simulating upvotes, and so we can simulate causal effects. Okay, so now onto the results. So we looked at about 100K Reddit comments across 13 different subreddits where there were these gender labels available. And we look at the question, as I motivated earlier, does perceived gender affect simulated upvotes? And I'm going to show the results for 3 methods in this talk. So I'm going to highlight the results of causal BERT that we discussed. I'll show another method that we describe in the paper called causal supervised topic models. Same idea, except we use topic models instead of text embeddings to get our representation. And the baseline is going to be a neural network that takes bags of words as input and uses those to predict the expected outcomes and the treatment. And so the reason I'm showing this particular baseline is this is actually the method that was the most competitive with the causal sufficient text embedding. And so I'm sort of already kind of leading you to the results, but let me set it up a little bit more. So we have ground truth effects across a range of confounding and a range of noise in the outcomes. And our goal is going to be to see how well the methods are going to recover these ground truth effects. And so, you know, sort of as a straw man, or rather like the most naive baseline here, here's this method that does not do any causal adjustment. So here it's just going to report the correlation between the gender label and the upvotes. And we can see that as the situation gets more confounded, this method really suffers. And so the neural network method, which is our baseline here, does some causal adjustment using the bag of words as input. And it does better than the unadjusted method, especially in the higher confounding regimes. But these causal sufficient text embeddings yield the most accurate estimate. And so they're able to recover the ground truth most accurately, even in sort of high confounding regimes. So we see that, causal BERT, even as the confounding gets quite high, is not too biased at recovering the ground truth effect. And so, this sort of reveals that the representation that we use for text when we do causal inference sort of can affect our downstream effect estimates. And so we wanted to apply this to the real Reddit comments, where we have not simulated upvotes, but in fact the true upvotes. And here we looked again at the unadjusted method and then causal BERT, and we estimated effects in 3 different subreddits. And we see that, as we adjust for confounders, much of the effects starts to go away compared to the unadjusted method. And of course, this is not an externally validated study. There's no truth here against which to compare. But I think the takeaway here really is that, the assumptions that we make when we do causal inference can really have substantive impacts on the conclusions that we can draw from the studies that we do. And so, so we talked about a situation where we had treatment labels, but we had text that contained confounding information. And so in some sense, that's like the, sort of say in a tantalizing way, an easier setting. And the harder setting is the case where there are properties of text that are treatments of interest. So, and these are latent properties that are buried in the text data. And so in this next part of the talk, I'm going to look at this setting. And to do this, I'm also going to set up a different motivating example. Here, I'm going to look at complaints from the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. So here, people, oh, I see a hand raised from Jason. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Dhanya. Nice to see you. I just want to check that I understood correctly that the perceived gender in what you just presented was just the label that the author used to indicate their gender. So right. It might be different from the gender that was actually perceived by the reader, right? For example, if the text says something like, I am a woman, or refers to, gives some weaker signal, like referring to my husband, which is some indicator that the person is a woman, although it's certainly not everybody with a husband is a woman. It might be that the reader made an inference about the gender, which could override what was written in the label. Maybe they're not looking at the label.
Yeah, so that's a great question. In that part of the talk, I'm supposing that the gender label that is associated with the text that supersedes whatever else might be inferred from the text document here. So I'm going to assume that there's not going to be these conflicts where someone has labeled themselves a certain way, but the reader is going to perceive something different from the actual writing.
Do you think there's any way to take that second kind of effect into account? I mean, you could build classifiers of perceived gender or something like that by collecting additional data. Maybe.
That's right. Yeah. And so actually that kind of motivates this, what I'm going to do here, where we're going to use the text itself to build like a proxy for various properties of the text. And so I think that this part of the talk might speak a bit more to what you're saying. I think one thing we have to be a little bit careful about is, and this part of the talk will address that as well, there's a tricky sort of pernicious condition in causal inference called overlap. So to do causal inference, we have to be able to imagine that we could even do interventions on the gender label for two different
right. This is what was concerning me.
Right? Exactly. And so right. So if it would be very hard to imagine doing this experiment of intervening on the gender label and expecting the reader to perceive the gender if in the text there's like somebody saying that here I am, I'm a 24 female. And so I think in that part of the talk, the core assumption is that the gender label that the user has provided will be the perceived gender, and the properties of text that we're going to extract, which are going to be orthogonal to that perceived gender, will be things like topic and writing style and other attributes that are not going to be too much of a proxy for the perceived gender.
Thanks very much. Thanks for clarifying.
Okay, great. And so, yeah, so that's a great question because it kind of segues to this part of the talk really nicely, where we have text data. Okay, so here's a complaint about a financial product, and we have a label. The Bureau collects whether or not complaints were responded to in a timely fashion. And so we're going to ask, what is the effect of politeness on the response time? So politeness is a property that we don't have labeled. It is buried in the text data, and we have to infer it. And so to set up the causal model of the world here, a reader comes along, and they're going to perceive this linguistic property of interest, which is politeness here, and a whole bunch of other properties about the text. And they're going to take these perceptions, and this will be their inputs to producing a timely response or not. And so now again, we're going to cast aside the fact that the treatment is a latent property, and we're going to try to use our interventional language to clarify and formalize causal effects. And so in just plain English, we're going to say the effect is the change in response time. If we could somehow intervene on the reader's perception of politeness, and we're going to look at the difference in expected outcomes across these two interventions on the perceived politeness. And so as before, to clarify the assumptions around confounding, there are functions of the text like topic and affect and tone and writing style and so many other things that could confound our causal inference here. So one example might be that complaints about banks are both often perceived as impolite, and they receive just faster response times on average. And so, we talked about doing causal adjustment. And so, why can't we just push through? So why is this setting harder? So here, unlike the world before, both the treatments and the confounders are unknown functions of the text. So there's no treatment label. Both the treatments and the confounding properties are sort of hidden and buried in the text data. Jason, is that another question? I just want to make sure.
No, just giving a thumbs up because you're talking about, you're answering my question.
Okay, awesome, great, wonderful. So good. And so I want to highlight sort of a technical wrinkle now that we've hit this. So going back to scrutinizing our backdoor adjustment formula, which is sort of underpinning causal inference with observational data, we look at our sort of two key ingredients here. We have to contrast these two expected outcomes. And what we're saying in this formula is that it has to be possible to imagine a world where a document is polite and impolite, given the aspects of the text Z. Okay, so to be a bit more mathematically precise, this corresponds to the overlap criteria in causal inference, otherwise also known as positivity. And so it's basically saying that in order for these expected outcomes to be valid, in order for us to even have a conditional that's defined, it has to be possible to both imagine a polite and impolite version of the document given Z. And so we sort of need this extra assumption in our setting. And the assumption, I'm going to state it a bit more informally, is that we have to assume that the parts of the text that predict the random variable y splits into two parts. Right? One part is the part that captures politeness. The other part captures other stuff, such that this overlap criteria is satisfied. And so one example where we might think, one sort of feasible way in which this might hold is if the predictive information is something like topic, right? If Z captures something like topic, then we can imagine an impolite and polite version of a complaint about banks. So that's reasonable. And so we have to make this sort of extra technical assumption. And now we want to push through with the observed data that we have and see how to actually estimate these effects. And so we have a corpus of response times and text. And again, no treatment labels, no confounder labels. And so our first insight here is to appeal to something that's commonly done in NLP, where we appeal to manually built lexicons or separately trained classifiers for some property. And the idea here is that these lexicons can act as like a noisy proxy for the reader's perception. So we don't know what the reader perceives, but we can predict the politeness using a classifier. And so this is sort of like a computer version of the reader that could be actually a noisy version of the reader. And so this is one insight for dealing with the latent treatment. And for dealing with the confounding aspects of text, we'll use a very similar insight to last time, that we have these flexible pre-trained models such as BERT and its cousin, the still BERT, which has fewer parameters. And these models are basically big feature extractors. So we can fine tune them to extract information that's relevant to various prediction tasks. And so using these ideas around expected outcomes, we can build a prediction task so that we can extract confounding properties from text. And that's what I'm going to show you. But before we get there, I just want to situate this work. And so some of the authors of the related work are in the audience right now, but this work connects to two big bodies of related work on proxy variables and causal inference, as well as causal effects of text. So related to the first body of work around proxy variables, typically the goal of this work is to correct entirely for the proxy noise. And this requires knowing the true model of how the proxy relates to its target. In this case, that would be how the classifier relates to the true politeness status. And so the second body of work typically focuses on doing randomized or having access to randomized experiments with text documents, or stronger modeling assumptions around sort of parametric models. And the contrast here is that in our work, what we're going to do is use a noisy proxy, and we're not going to correct for the noise from the proxy, but rather we'll push through and estimate effects using flexible NLP methods, and then we're going to try to bound the bias of the effect afterwards. Okay, so that's where I'm headed. And so the algorithm that I'll describe first before showing the theory is the text cause algorithm. It's going to take as input text documents and a proxy label and an outcome, and it'll output an effect estimate. And the sketch is very similar to earlier, where we adapt existing embedding methods. And we adapt them to output causally sufficient embeddings that contain the information that we need here for causal inference, and some predictions. And we're going to use the predictions to estimate effects. And so here's the sort of cartoon of the algorithm. Here we actually, I have showed a picture of BERT, but actually we used the still BERT. And it's is very similar. It takes as input documents, and with every document, it's going to associate a document embedding, lambda, and we're going to train two classifiers. Okay, one classifier is going to predict the outcomes for documents that are predicted to be polite. The second classifier is going to predict outcomes for documents that are predicted to be impolite. And so the key here is exactly this. We're doing prediction of Y given the predicted politeness. Okay, so we give this politeness information so that the embeddings are going to learn other properties that are orthogonal to politeness. Okay, so we want to make sure, again, going back to that overlap idea, we want to make sure that lambda is not capturing things that are too similar to politeness. And so by doing this conditioning, we're going to kind of encourage the embeddings to capture the confounding properties instead. And now that we have these predictions, we can use them to estimate effects downstream as earlier. And so I'm going to skip that step and instead get to this question of, okay, well, this method's going to output effect estimates. And we did this using a noisy version of the reader. We don't have access to their perceptions. We have predicted perceptions from a classifier. And so we want to know what the error is. And what we're going to do is try to characterize the difference between the estimated effect from our method and the effects that we would have gotten if, for some reason, we'd had the true reader's perceived politeness. And so what we show in this paper is that actually the situation is nice. It's quite benign. So the estimated effect attenuates the true effect with a bias that depends on the misclassification rate. Okay, so what this is saying is that in some sense the effect isn't going to may not be perfect, but it's sort of a conservative estimate of the true effect. So the magnitude may decrease, but the sign will stay the same. There are some assumptions that we need to make here to get this, which I won't go into, but I can talk offline about. But the key is that the situation is sort of benign for us. And so this is actually really surprising in a sort of punchy result. And we want to see now how this method bears out in practice. As before, we're stuck in this case where we don't have ground truth against which to evaluate estimation error of our methods that calculate effects. And so we're going to appeal to the same technique as last time. And let me give an example this time with Amazon reviews. So we have Amazon product reviews. We have product ratings, which are going to act as sort of a true treatment label here. And remember, the method is not going to get access to this label, but the product rating is going to give a signal of sort of the sentiment of the document. And we also have the product categories, which are some property of the text. And so as before, we're going to simulate this time product clicks, and we'll do it as a log linear function of the rating and the product category. Okay? So the category is sort of our confounder here. And the game we're going to play is increase the confounding due to the product category. And as we create these increasingly sort of bad situations, we're going to see how well our methods are able to recover effects. And so we have this corpus of 20K or so Amazon product reviews. And I'm going to talk about the results for 5 different methods. Let me just start from the bottom, actually. So the method that I'll call semi-oracle is this method that I talked about that is in the body of work that corrects for mismeasurement due to proxy treatment. So we're going to compare against that as sort of a near oracle. And so we have our method that I just described, text cause, and I'll also describe these 3 methods that use different proxies, but rather than adjusting for the text and all the confounding properties that live in the text, they only observe for some observed covariates, namely the product category. And so as before, we're going to have these increasingly confounded scenarios, and we have sort of ground truth effects here, and we're going to see how close our methods get to these effects. And so what we see is that the text cause algorithm ends up being the method that is most accurate at recovering causal effects among all the methods. And so the takeaway here is that, even though some of the other methods were adjusting for some relevant confounding information, like the product category, this text cause algorithm, which extracts confounding information from the data, it produces the most accurate effect estimate. And so we looked at a corpus of real financial product complaints labeled with the time taken to address the complaint. So this is back to that motivating example of the causal effect of politeness on response time. And as a proxy, we used this politeness detection package that was produced recently. And again, I want to note that we don't have ground truth here. So we don't have sort of external validation. But what we saw is that, compared to this method unadjusted, which doesn't do any causal adjustment at all, as we start doing layers of causal adjustment, our conclusions really change. And so, as before, the assumptions that drive causal inference can, substantively change the conclusions that we draw from a study. And so to sort of summarize this part of the talk, we looked at a setting where properties of text are the factors that we're after. There are treatments of interest. And so I've looked at settings beyond just sort of text documents. In my work, I've also looked at effects where we have properties in text in online debates. So here, rather than having just text IID text documents, we have conversations where people take turns in a dialogue, and what the first person says affects downstream what the next person says, and so on. And so I've also studied this this bigger question of finding latent properties, latent treatments in text in the context of online debates. But I won't be able to go into that in this talk, and I'm just sort of going to reference the paper here if you're interested. And so now I want to kind of think prospectively. I want to look ahead and think about some of the open questions and issues that we have going on today. And so, broadly today, the effects of text and language are not simply implicated in upvotes or people's response times and things like that. Text and language effects are implicated in misinformation, extreme partisanship. And moreover, these effects are being exacerbated by social networks. On a very different end of the spectrum, we have this opportunity to use data and statistical methods to understand and inspect and scrutinize our own biases and algorithmic biases, but we want to really understand the limitations of data and statistical methods. So this is sort of this big landscape that we are situated in. And so, what I'm very optimistic that we can understand more about the world with data and with analysis and with computational methods. But I think that to do this, we need a new way of thinking. So this kind of motivates my vision. My vision is to kind of envision a data analysis pipeline that bridges machine learning and causal thinking. And the way that I sort of depict this pipeline is inspired by the scientific method. So, we at different phases observe and hypothesize, we calculate, and we evaluate. And of course, these stages are not done in a vacuum, in isolation. They inform each other. And all along this pipeline are opportunities to bridge machine learning and causal thinking. And so the first phase, things that I'm interested in are formulating and identifying new causal questions about language and networks and fairness. And I'm talking about sort of fairness writ large here, not just about algorithmic bias, but also bias in our society, bias in data, for example, selection bias. I'm interested in developing flexible methods that can combine causal knowledge and the language of causal models to estimate effects, as we did in this talk, to be robust and fair. And so flexible here, I'm also sort of alluding to methods that can deal with network and graph structured data. And then finally, you know, we don't develop methods and conclusions in a vacuum. One of the things that I'm very excited about is working closely with experts to build methods that assess the robustness of causal inference techniques, and to also collaborate with applied researchers to conduct large-scale digital experiments or large-scale experiments more broadly. So this is sort of taken together and sort of at a high level, my vision for where we want to go next. And before I kind of start to wrap up the talk, I will just take a second to thank all of my collaborators for the papers that I described in this talk. And then I'll just end by thanking you for your time and for listening. And I'm very happy to start taking questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dhanya, for a wonderful talk. It's looking like Mark is muted, so I'm happy to run the Q&A session. If there are any questions, please speak up. I think there are some questions already. Go ahead.
I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ben Vanderme. This is a nice talk. I was hoping you could say a little bit more on how you derived a document level embedding via BERT. That part went by well quickly. Yeah.
Awesome, great. So what we did here is we evaluated some of the competing methods in literature to do this. So the thing that seemed to work well was BERT associates with every document this kind of token called the CLS token. And it's very common that people take the embedding for that token as the embedding for the document. So that's what we did here. We also looked at just averaging the word embeddings for the document, but it seems like the CLS token was just as good, if not better.
Mm-hmm. And was it the case that the documents always fit in the buffer size that the encoder required, or if they were always just really short documents?
Yeah, so the Reddit comments were typically, we sort of looked at the histogram of the number of tokens, and they were generally quite short, sort of followed the power law distribution here. But when they were past, 256 tokens or whatever we limited, we would just trim the document.
Okay, thank you.
So while folks are gathering their thoughts, I had a question or two. So you were talking about semi-synthetic data, right? And so I'm just trying to understand exactly what was synthetic about it. Is it the case that you kept, so the thing that you were simulating was the relationship between treatment and text and the outcome, and you kept the other stuff fixed? Is that true?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay, great. So then presumably, if I were an evil adversary, I could pick that conditional distribution to be incredibly inconvenient for you and make it so that, or for your method, and make it so that you would get a lot of bias. And so I was just wondering, I mean, you're doing these simulations, of course you can pick that distribution to be helpful and then you get nice results. And I was just wondering, like, have you tried very hard to break the method by picking adversarial versions of that distribution, or have some sensitivity analysis or something like that? That's my first question. The second question is perhaps related. So one question I always have with these lower dimensional representations is, if I think about the observed data distribution, which includes all the clinical variables and text, it must be, so is it the case that there are restrictions? So whatever it is, whatever assumption it is that allows you to pick this low dimensional representation, does that impose restrictions on the observed data? Yes, no. If yes, I mean, it's probably very complicated, but is there anything we can say about what those restrictions are and whether we can check if they hold? Because that presumably matters a great deal for whether you should use the method or not, right?
Yeah, awesome. So let me start with the first question. So perhaps one of the most adversarial ways to attack this method is by having exogenous confounding that is not in the text. So one thing that we did was conduct a sensitivity analysis where we had an increasing amount of exogeneity. So the outcomes were simulated depending on some property of the text, the observed treatment, and something that the method has no hope of finding because it's not in the text data. And so we cranked up the dependence between this exogenous confounder and the outcome, and we sort of plotted the sensitivity, the bias of the estimated effects, and we saw that actually it takes quite a dramatic level of exogenous confounding before this method like really starts to fall apart. And so, of course, I mean, this is as expected. As you get more and more confounding, the method does get more biased, but it takes you need to get to a bad state before it's very the conclusions are quite bad. And of course, there are other ways to construct really hard distributions to try to estimate. We looked at some nonlinear ways of simulating the outcomes rather than with the linear models that I showed, but again, those didn't seem to have a big change empirically on how the methods were performing. And Ilya, do you mind sort of saying your second question again for me?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I guess like just to say a little bit more about the question you just answered, I guess like one way to rephrase it, do you have a way of, so it's 100% true that I could construct outcome conditional distributions to just screw up any method. This is just a thing that's true. So I guess my question, like just, maybe this is not something you have to answer now, but just like, are there ways of knowing how to construct such things to screw up your method? That'd be good to know. If for no other reason than to just like try to get a sense in what cases the method doesn't work very well, because I think that's true for all methods like this.
Totally.
The second question is just about the observed law restriction. So this is not a very machine learning way perhaps of thinking about this, but basically you have some observed data distribution. It's very high dimensional, and you have some assumptions on it perhaps that allow you to extract a lower dimensional embedding of text somehow that adjusts for confounding. So this is not true of all distributions and only some distributions. And so my question is, for the distributions where you get lucky in the way that lets you use your method, do we know anything about how the observed data distribution is restricted by those assumptions? So it could be that it is, but we don't know because it's complicated restrictions. Or it could be there are some simple things we could test for. Because basically, if it does restrict the data in some way, we could maybe test for that or do a goodness of fit or something. And then if it's not, the data is not cooperating, we could say we shouldn't use our method. So I was just wondering if you knew anything about that. That's
a great question. So yeah, I think, and of course it's obviously, tricky because many of our assumptions are not going to leave any, imprints on the data. But some of the things that I can think about that are, I almost think about them as sort of inductive biases that we have that are kind of going to guide these embedding methods to capture meaningful stuff. One thing is that text has low dimensional structure in it. This is what allows us to construct meaningful embeddings in the first place. And so I think, this is not an assumption that I've really discussed in this talk, but we assume this, or we use this as a strong guiding principle that, indeed text has low dimensional patterns in it. This is what humans pick up on when they read text and they produce outcomes. And so that's certainly like a thing that constrains in some way our observed data distribution. The other thing is, the other sort of key property that this method exploits is the ability of embeddings to predict the expected outcomes. But of course, like all of that kind of goes through under the assumption that the text contains all the confounding properties. And unfortunately, I think that assumption is the way to sort of test. There's no testing for it, but rather we'd have to sort of construct sensitivity analyses to see how bad things could get if we had unobserved confounding.
Okay, great. Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? I didn't want to monopolize the time, of course.
I do have a few, but I'm meeting with Dhanya in like 5 minutes. So.
Well, you could certainly share with us as well.
Other people should go.
Well, okay.
I think
Randall, if you're
Randall
trying to speak, I
might be
think
saying
you're-
something. Yeah.
Okay, so let me start again. I know we're way over time, but I have a question. All of this has been done with data that's been extracted from Reddit, right? Where you're a passive consumer. And so to enhance causality, you'd like to build experiments. Maybe you inject natural experiments, maybe you conduct an RCT. What's your experience with IRBs and manipulating Reddit? Like, what's the potential for researchers to inject content into the internet? And so that's such a broad question, but
Right.
I'd love to hear your first thoughts.
Yeah, so I'll let me just admit I don't have a ton of experience with IRBs. One thing that I'll say on this idea of building like a Reddit bot that debates or something like that. I've talked about this with people a lot, actually. This sort of naturally comes up, but some folks who've worked on building bots like this have commented that actually those experiments are surprisingly hard to run because it seems like people recognize that something is a bot and their reactions to it are very adversarial and very different than it would be to a human. So it sort of like ruins the experiment. But that being said, I think there are like really interesting ways to conduct experiments here. It may not be via Reddit in this bot way exactly, but there's work on how you can like randomly give people text to read and solicit feedback from them on how they responded to the text and so on. So I think that is something I'm interested in.
Thanks. If it's marginally ethical, I'm interested. So.
All right, great. I think we're a little bit over now. So I'd like to thank Dhanya for a wonderful talk and for everyone to have joined us and for your questions. And I hope to talk to you later, Dhanya. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.